For a year and a half, the armies of Europe were at each other's throats. With the front locked in a stalemate for almost 2 years, both sides would launch grand offensives in an attempt to end the deadlock, which would drastically drain the manpower, supplies, and morale of the nations that launched them. Macedonia was one of the lesser-known fronts of the Great War, and it would open as the fighting in Gallipoli was coming to a close. Serbia had successfully maintained its independence from Austria-Hungary throughout most of 1914 and 15. The Central Powers would launch a massive invasion that would push the Serbs to the brink of annihilation. This time, Austria would have help. German troops would be reinforcing them. Bulgaria would also join them, as they were eager to regain territory lost in the 1913 Balkan War. In October of 1915, they began the attack, quickly capturing the capital of Belgrade and almost destroying the Serbian army. The battle-weary and depleted Serbs retreated across the mountainous western border into Montenegro in sub-zero temperatures. Out of the initial 400,000 soldiers and civilians that began the journey, only 120,000 would reach the Adriatic coast. They would be picked up by Italian ships and taken to Greece, which was facing internal issues of its own. The Prime Minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, and the Parliament were pro-allies. Meanwhile, the Greek king, Constantine I, had served in the German army and was for neutrality. After the invasion of Serbia, Venizelos allowed the Allies to occupy the port city of Salonika. Yet the king and the general staff opposed this action and he was forced to step down from office. Constantine then set up his own interim prime minister, which supported neutrality, and began taking control of the government. German and Bulgarian troops were also given permission to occupy parts of eastern Macedonia, as a counterbalance to the Allied occupation of Salonika. In August of 1916, several anti-Constantine officers started a coup and created their own government in the Allied-occupied city of Salonika. Venizelos was put in charge and promptly declared war on the Central Powers. Greece was now governed by two opposing regimes, one which was pro-neutrality yet didn't have the backing of the people, and one that was pro-war and had the backing of the Greek populace. In 1917, Constantine was removed from the throne, uniting Greece and officially making it an Allied power. Fighting would continue to drag on in Macedonia for the continuation of the war. Ever since Winston Churchill launched the Gallipoli campaign, the armies of the Sultan had been under constant pressure. The agrarian economy of the empire wasn't able to handle fighting in Turkey, the Caucasus, and Mesopotamia all at the same time. To make things worse, the Ottoman army fighting the Russians in modern-day Armenia and Azerbaijan had suffered 60,000 casualties. An additional 150,000 soldiers and civilians had died from disease by May of 1916. The Young Turks, the ruling political party at the time, believed that the Armenian Christian minority would attempt to rebel against the Ottoman Empire, as they had more ties to the Russian Empire, which was also Orthodox Christian. In April 1915, Armenians in the city of Van clashed with local garrison troops and barricaded themselves in their own neighborhoods. This gave the Ottoman authorities an excuse to arrest 250 Armenian politicians and intellectuals in Istanbul. They would also order mass deportations and killings of all Armenians. Most of the dirty work was done by auxiliary troops and local civilians. Countless Armenian Christians from all around the empire were forced to leave their homes and march to the inhospitable Syrian desert, or just be killed outright. Even if one did make it to Syria, they would be housed in concentration camps until the end of the war. It is estimated that 600,000 to over 1 million Armenians died in the genocide. It still affects international relationships between Turkey and Armenia to this day. It was truly one of the darkest chapters of the First World War. With the Western Front still locked in trench warfare, the German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, wished to end the war not by breaking through the Allied lines, but by draining the enemy of resources and manpower. The place he chose to test his strategy was at Verdun, which was surrounded by a series of fortresses. These had held out against the Germans in the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, and were of high value to the French people. If Verdun was taken, France would sacrifice hundreds of thousands of soldiers to retake it. This is exactly what Falkenhayn wanted. In a memo he wrote, "The forces of France will bleed to death." 1,000 artillery pieces and thousands more men were brought to Verdun for the attack. The French also noticed the German preparations and reinforced their own lines. On the 21st of February, the battle began. After 10 hours of shelling, the first wave of German troops went over the top. Reinforced by new elite stormtrooper units, which were trained to be effective shock troops, and using a new weapon, the flamethrower, they quickly made headway. By day 3 of the battle, they had taken several villages and were now poised to capture the forts. On the 24th, the current French commander of the defense of Verdun, Joseph Joffre, was replaced by General Philippe Pétain, commander of the Second Army. More troops and supplies soon flooded in along the last remaining road to Verdun. La Voie Sacrée, or the Sacred Way, would be used by the French for the duration of the battle. Pétain would also be faced with the challenge of losing a fort. On the very next day, the Germans would launch an assault targeted towards the French positions guarding Douaumont village. They quickly overran the French and forced them to retreat to the village itself. Having achieved their objective in under an hour, the Germans pressed the attack, now assaulting Douaumont village. A French machine gun opened fire and forced the Germans to take cover in a ditch in the woods surrounding the town. To make things worse, their own artillery had no idea that German troops were attacking the village and began to shell their own men. Now stuck between a rock and a hard place, the only way the Germans were to escape the bombardment would be to advance past the village of Douaumont and find a way inside Fort Douaumont. The party of desperate soldiers cautiously advanced toward the fortress, still being shelled by their own men. After cutting a path through the barbed wire, they crept inside the unusually empty fortress. After several minutes of searching, the Germans found the French garrison. Instead of the several hundred-strong force one would expect inside a fortress, the French soldiers stationed at Douaumont were merely a skeleton crew of around 25 men responsible for maintenance. This is because all the heavy guns in Douaumont and all the other fortresses had been removed, after the Germans had proved that forts were obsolete during the Battle of Liege and the capture of Antwerp in 1914. The Germans took the French garrison captive and claimed Douaumont as their own. By sheer luck, they had taken a French symbol of national pride and patriotism by just walking through the door. The Royal Navy had subjected Germany to a blockade for almost 2 years now, and it was beginning to take its toll on their economy and war production. In order to break the blockade, the numerically inferior Kriegsmarine would have to find a way to destroy the High Seas Fleet. Their plan called for the isolation and annihilation of British squadrons, using the limited number of surface ships and U-boats at their disposal, and not to engage in a pitched battle. The start of the operation was scheduled for May 30th, although bad weather kept the German Navy stuck in port. The English would also intercept a radio transmission notifying them that a naval action would begin soon. On May 31st, 1916, the German fleet under Admiral Reinhard Scheer pulled out of harbor and sailed north in search of targets. 60 miles off the coast of Denmark, the German scouting force under Vice Admiral Franz Hipper spotted the British High Seas Fleet. Seeing only the vanguard, he moved to engage the enemy. Hipper's group was able to sink 2 ships before the rest of the British fleet arrived. Both scouting parties then joined their main forces. Seeing that he was facing the entire High Seas Fleet, Hipper turned his force south and began to run for home. Half an hour later, he turned back towards the British, only to turn back south 15 minutes later in a fighting retreat. By 10 o'clock, the sun had set. The English fleet would continue to harass the Germans until the early hours of June 1st. Both sides would claim victory. The Kriegsmarine destroyed 14 ships at the cost of 11 of their own, although the British prevented the blockade from being broken and weakened the German Navy, keeping Germany in an economic stranglehold. With the situation at Verdun getting worse by the day, the British High Command formulated a plan to take the pressure off the French army. They chose the Somme River Valley for their grand offensive. Scheduled for midsummer, the offensive would be launched in tandem with other attacks on the Italian and Eastern fronts. Their battle plan called for a 5-day bombardment, which would destroy enemy trenches and barbed wire. After which, infantry would go over the top and occupy enemy positions. Cavalry would also be held in reserve to exploit any gaps in enemy lines. Unfortunately, things didn't go as planned. The bombardment failed to destroy the barbed wire. In fact, German wiring parties were even able to set up new sections. To make things worse, command expected the German frontline trenches to either be destroyed or abandoned, and they ordered that the advancing infantry walk in orderly lines, reminiscent of the Napoleonic Wars. On July 1st, the British attacked. The Germans were waiting for them. On the first day alone, almost 20,000 Imperial soldiers would lose their lives. The Allies would be bogged down at the Somme for several months. Yet despite several new innovations being introduced, such as the tank, they were unable to gain enough ground to break the enemy lines, although they did succeed in taking pressure off the French at Verdun. However, Allied offensive efforts would be much more effective on the Eastern Front. Designed to relieve the French at Verdun, General Alexei Brusilov presented his plan to the Russian High Command in April of 1916. The aptly named Brusilov Offensive called for massive attacks along the southern sectors of the front against the Austro-Hungarians. The Tsar approved the plan, and the Russian army began making preparations for the operation. Unlike earlier offensives, the Russians learned from their previous mistakes and would deceive their enemy, broadcasting fake radio messages and setting up dummy artillery pieces. On June 4th, after a lengthy artillery bombardment, the Russians went over the top. By the 8th, the Austrian lines crumbled. Cavalry exploited the gaps in the lines, causing chaos for the Central Powers. To make things worse for the Austro-Hungarians, all their experienced divisions had been transferred to the west to fight the Italians, leaving inexperienced units to replace them. For the next 2 months, the Russian steamroller advanced, capturing Lutsk, Brody, and Stanislaw. By August 9th, the Austro-Hungarians finally reformed their lines and stopped the Russians, although they continued to launch attacks until September 20th. Despite the Allied success, the Brusilov offensive was one of the costliest military operations of the war. with both sides suffering around 1 million casualties. Yet the offensive achieved its goal of drawing German attention away from Verdun, giving the French army an opportunity to regroup. As of April 1916, the Germans continued their attacks at Verdun, besieging and capturing Fort Vaux. They would also attempt to take other forts in the area. Although, after the Somme and Brusilov offensives, the Germans were forced to transfer men and materiel away from Verdun, which gave the French an opportunity to launch attacks of their own. Douaumont would be secured on October 24th at the expense of 100,000 Frenchmen. Vaux was taken on November 2nd. By this point, the Germans were on the back foot. All of their gains had been reversed, and 300,000 men had died. After a massive 2-day-long French attack, the last of the captured territories were lost, ending the battle. The Battle of Verdun was one of the longest battles of military history, only being overshadowed by Bakhmut in the ongoing Russo-Ukrainian War. Yet despite its intensity and the massive amount of men and resources poured into the battle by both sides, it only got more and more men killed throughout the entirety of Europe. Luckily, by its end, winter had come. Armies could rest and prepare for 1917.